And so the piece we wrote today is about how Estonia, country 3/4 of the size of West Virginia, that has 1.4 million residents and is a former Soviet state, is now an Article 5 member of NATO and has a navy with a grand total of 8 ships in it, and tried to board a Russian oil tanker in the Gulf of Finland 10 days ago or whenever it was, much to some controversy to some of our subscribers who predominantly consume presumably just legacy media. But we think it is important that Trump and the US people have an honest conversation about whether they're willing to have World War III with Russia over the Gulf of Finland. A naval blockade is an act of war. Are we prepared to go to war with Russia, the world's largest and most sophisticated nuclear superpower, over this issue? And if we're not, then we have to start asking ourselves serious questions about what it means to be a NATO member at all.
Welcome to Discourse with Christian. I'm your host, Christian White, and today's guest is Doomberg. He is the voice behind one of the most widely read Substacks in finance, renowned for making complex topics easy to understand. Doomberg focuses on energy, economics, and geopolitics. With a background rooted in the commodity sector, the Doomberg team blends insider insight with sharp, accessible commentary. Doomberg, thanks so much for being on today.
Christian, it's my honor. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
We'd love to start off asking you, what's your current take on the global economy and financial markets?
Well, global economy, a bit of chaos, of course, subsequent to the events of Liberation Day. Unclear how the puts and takes and the various flows of that disruptive event will ultimately manifest in the short and medium and long-term horizon. The markets we care about, the energy markets, seem very well supplied from a physical perspective. Prices are pretty reasonable. Not much in the way of sort of bullish tailwinds to be seen on the horizon outside of geopolitical crises, which are always a possibility and need to be watched out for. But broadly speaking, much depends on how the next 3 to 6 months work out with regard to the tariff negotiations. There's been a significant effort on the part of the Trump administration to rewire much of the U.S. economy, and how that all plays out is going to be, I think, the story of 25 and into 26.
And as it relates to Trump and geopolitics and kind of resource realignment and such, I have down that you've mentioned in previous appearances, Trump's recent visit to Saudi Arabia, suggesting a strategic energy and mining realignment, possibly involving gold and copper. If you could dive into that, that'd be awesome.
One of the things about President Trump, especially 47, that many people observing President Trump don't realize is that he, in the intervening period between his time as president and his reascension to that lofty position, laid out in extreme detail both what he wanted to do and why in a series of videos called Agenda 47. And he started publishing these videos, I believe, in the spring of 2023. And these videos, I think they number in the several dozen, are Trump's plan for Agenda 47. And he has followed quite literally everything he said he was going to do to the best of his abilities, as laid out in those videos. And I think it would, serve many analysts well to take a pause and go back and watch those videos to get a true understanding of what Trump is intending to do. And in so doing, you get the opportunity to cut through some of the media spin about what's actually going on. Now, it remains an open question whether Trump has sufficient political capital to create a bridge between the clearly unsustainable path that the U.S. fiscal situation was on as a country, and to the nirvana end state that Trump envisions. And it also remains to be seen whether such an end state is in fact the nirvana that Trump thinks it is. Trump has a desire to return manufacturing to the United States. Trump has a desire to end global conflicts. Trump has a desire to make America great again. And in some ways, Trump may be naive, but who are we to tell? But the direction of travel is very clear. And I think everybody listening should go back and watch some of those videos. And so tariffs, as Trump has rolled them out, which, by the way, there are serious constitutional questions about whether or not the president has the authority to do the things that Trump has been doing. The tariffs were very predictable. He's been talking about tariffs since 1980, right? And so he was always going to do these things. And he is running a substantial experiment that only a person who, quote, sincerely believes what he is doing, and we think he is sincere, and is not going to stand for re-election again, could ever try to pull off. But it remains to be seen whether he'll be successful. And I think that is the sort of overarching dominant theme of the next 12 to 18 months before the midterm elections next year. And depending on how those midterm elections turn out, all bets are off.
It relates to geopolitical matters and such going on. You mentioned, and I saw today in a recent article you posted on your Substack pertaining to Estonia kind of being a potential flashpoint, if you will, or a trigger of greater bringing about conflict, if you will, potentially. Could you unpack that if you could?
Sure. This is a significant challenge for Trump. So Trump prides himself and campaigned on not having started, quote unquote, any new wars during his first term. And deep down, I think he believes that the war in Ukraine was a catastrophic mistake. And we agree with Trump in that assessment. But he also fails to understand a few critically important things. One is, we believe, and maybe it's all just a negotiating tactic, and again, who are we to judge, that Trump views this as, quote unquote, not his war, because he didn't start it. But the US is a party to that war, whether Trump likes it or not. And Biden made the US a party to that war, and I think that was a mistake. I think Trump thinks that was a mistake. But you can't have it both ways. From the Russian perspective, the US is actively supplying weapons and intelligence that are being used to target deep inside Russia. And Trump wouldn't put up with that if the Chinese were giving weaponry and intelligence to the Canadians, and the Canadians were firing missiles, targeting Washington, D.C., all hell would break loose, and justifiably so. So the real question becomes, do you think Russia is a superpower peer or a paper tiger? And I think Trump knows that Russia is no paper tiger and needs to be treated as a superpower peer, but can't bring himself to recognize that he, Donald Trump, 5 months into his presidency, is now a party to that war and can't have it both ways. He can't demand to mediate the war without first ending the U.S.'s participation in it, but you can't end the U.S.'s participation in it because Ukraine would collapse in a matter of weeks, and then that would be pinned on Trump. And so he's stuck. And I think that is how Trump unsticks himself in the next few months will define much of his legacy as president. It's hard to lose wars. And so the piece we wrote today is about how Estonia, a country 3/4 of the size of West Virginia, that has 1.4 million residents, and is a former Soviet state, is now an Article 5 member of NATO, and has a navy with a grand total of 8 ships in it, and tried to board a Russian oil tanker in the Gulf of Finland 10 days ago, or whenever it was. And Russia buzzed the Estonian Navy with a fighter jet. Russia has long said that interfering with the shipment of Russian goods, predominantly from the port of St. Petersburg, in the Gulf of Finland was a red line that would trigger a military response. What is Estonia doing trying to board oil tankers in the Gulf of Finland? Now, the Western media, legacy media, portrayed that event as Russia violating NATO airspace. We gave a different view of those events through our masthead, much to some controversy to some of our subscribers who predominantly consume, presumably, just legacy media. But we think it is important that Trump and the US people have an honest conversation about whether they're willing to have World War III with Russia over the Gulf of Finland. A naval blockade is an act of war. Are we prepared to go to war with Russia, the world's largest and most sophisticated nuclear superpower, over this issue? And if we're not, then we have to start asking ourselves serious questions about what it means to be a NATO member at all. So that was the point of the piece today. It's one that we gave a lot of thought to before we published it. And, wars, one of the reasons you don't get into them is you might lose them. And NATO's losing this war. And how we reconcile that loss, how Trump personally reconciles that loss, is going to have a meaningful impact on the arc of his presidency. And I don't know how it's going to go. I don't envy him, given the cards he inherited in this regard.
Now, it has been said, of course, whether it's neocons or other figures and such over in Europe, about wanting to continue the war, of course, and to get more countries involved and such. Do you see there being some type of a false flag event triggering things, whether there or elsewhere in the world?
That's always the risk. Keep an eye on the remaining natural gas pipelines that flow from Russia to Turkey, under the sea. And those have been targeted for destruction, much in the same way that Nord Stream was. Look, there's a wide faction in Washington, D.C., call them neocons, call them whatever you want, the Uniparty, that still believe the U.S. is the global omnipower. And frankly, they're corrupt. They don't have America's best interests in mind. And when you're in the bomb-making business, peace is a working capital problem. We are unabashedly isolationist. We live in America. We think all war is a racket. It's called the Department of Defense, not the Department of Proactive Offense. And name a war that went well since post-World War II. I think it's long past time that we try a different approach. And I think instinctively that's what Trump wants to do. Whether he can pull it off remains to be seen. So at the same time that the Starmers and the Macrons and the van der Leyens and the Lindsey Grahams and the Keith Kellogg's are advocating for sanctions, by the way, which just aren't going to work, and escalation. Trump is trying to cut a deal with Iran. And we see all the familiar characters on Twitter bemoaning selling out to the Iranians, or, there's just it's just undeniable that there is a large faction in Washington, D.C., and it's bipartisan, that thinks all war is good. Don't count us among them. We think all war is bad. We think that isolationism is a proper approach to the modern era. We do not live in a unipolar world anymore. China has far surpassed the U.S. in manufacturing might, which is just a derivative input into military might. NATO just lost a war with Russia with China's help. You could view the Russia-Ukraine war as a proxy war between the U.S. and China, if you so chose, as a model. It is interesting to contemplate events through that lens. We underestimate our enemies always, and by we, I mean the West, and the United States in particular, and the neocon wing of both parties. I'm old enough to remember when being anti-war was a left position. Now it's a right-leaning, Putin puppet position. Anytime that you come out against the narrative that all war is good and all escalation is good, you're viewed as a Putin enabler. And so we got a lot of those types of comments to our piece today from our subscribers, which again doesn't surprise us, doesn't even disappoint us. It just is what it is. And so we hold our views authentically. We show our homework. If we wanted to build a business that just maximized subscribers, we probably wouldn't write pieces like we did today. But intellectual integrity is just an important part of our brand as the size of our business. And so, that's our view.
Yeah, I just wanted to second on what you said, how in the past, it's kind of like been a political switch where if you were on perhaps the left side of the aisle, you were anti-war. And, now if you're conservative leaning or what have you, that you're, obviously against it and such. I wanted to add, having come from a military family and having been in the military, my view has completely changed. And for me, it was Smedley Butler's book, of course, War is a Racket, kind of opening my eyes and kind of questioning, the narrative.
I'm all for the military, for supporting our troops, and the best way to support our troops is not to put them in harm's way unnecessarily. The purpose of the U.S. Department of Defense is to defend the homeland. And it annoys some people when we say this, but I believe it to be true. And I've asked some of my relatives this question. When did you begin to care about who rules the Russian-speaking part of the Donbass? And do you think it is worth spending U.S. blood and treasury to have a say in that? And when did you start to think that, and who instructed you to start thinking that way? How did all of these Ukrainian flags show up on Twitter, for example, in 2022, as though the history of that conflict began in 2022? It is a gross distortion of history to say that. Now, when you say such things, you get accused of spreading Russian talking points. The world's largest and most sophisticated nuclear superpower gets to have a point of view, and we think it would be foolish to ignore that point of view. One of the things we do is we read the propaganda of all sides in a desire to try to understand what's actually true. We read the British press. We read the Kiev Independent. And yes, sometimes we read TASS and listen to sources that explain how Russia's thinking. And we read Chinese state media. We used to read the papers from Hong Kong, but now they've become indistinguishable from Chinese state media. We read the Canadian press. We read the left and the right in the US. Sometimes it's okay to read things you disagree with. In fact, we should all be doing much more of that. And when you do that, you begin to develop a pattern of which of the papers is pure propaganda and which is closer to the truth over time. An amazing article in the Washington Post last week, I don't know if you saw it. Ukraine is actually winning the war, and if we just stick to it for another year, Russia's going to collapse. And Trump is turning his back against Ukraine at the moment that we should be escalating and pouring more money and resources and treasure and blood into this war. Now I know about the Washington Post, right? When you read the Ukrainian press, and they're telling themselves a wildly different story about how desperate the situation is on the front lines. And when you watch the Ukraine mapping projects like Deep State every day, like I do, and you recognize that they're biased towards Ukraine, and even they have to admit that for the past 14 months, it's been one-way traffic. And the situation is growing dire, and they're losing the drone war. It's a war of attrition, and Russia knows how to fight those. And then you read what's in the Washington Post, and then you have to ask yourself, why is the Washington Post publishing this now? Right? And so that's just the reality. But if you don't read everything and you only read the Washington Post, then how can you have a holistic view as to what the actual truth is? And in our business, we're going to get a lot of things wrong. But the more things we get right over time, the better we'll be, the more valuable we'll be to our subscribers who stick by us. And that means sometimes we're going to say things that our subscribers are reading for the first time. And I think many of them come to us because we're willing to print those things.
And as it relates to China and the U.S., if you care to unpack that a little bit, and then as well as Iran and other events in the Middle East.
Yeah. So again, there's a wing in Washington that wants to go to war with Iran. I don't know why. We would prefer as a team to not see war with Iran. One of the things that the U.S., aggressive wing in the U.S. always does is it radically underestimates the opponents. We wrote a piece called October Surprise, a bit of a controversial piece, where we predicted that no, Israel and the U.S. will not attack Iran's oil and gas infrastructure, as they were threatening to do, for the very sane reason that any objective analysis of the exchange of missiles between the two countries would say that Israel has a serious problem. It was unable to stop at least some of the ballistic missiles that Iran fired into Israel. mostly for demonstration purposes. The Washington Post itself even admitted as much, and we quoted it in the piece. You can count on one hand the number of power plants and water treatment facilities that Iran would have to take out in order to cripple civilian life in Israel. And we suggested in that piece that, yes, Israel may have the long rumored bomb, but Iran has, in its own way, mutually assured destruction. They could overwhelm the Golden Dome. They proved it. And there are very sensitive targets that everybody knows the exact geolocations of that could be taken out, that would bring the Israeli grid down and crush its water supply. Those are facts. And so you might not like those facts. You might think that's propaganda, but it's not. You could go and independently see that 85% of Israel's water comes from a half a dozen desalination plants, and that the vast majority of its power is made in a half a dozen natural gas facilities. They've recently become self-sufficient in natural gas, and great for them. But in a world where Iran demonstrates that it can, say, hit an Israeli Air Force base with a ballistic missile and the air defense system in place at that time was inadequate to defend against it, then it doesn't take much of a leap to say it's highly unlikely that Israel is going to attack either the nuclear research facility or the oil and gas infrastructure of Iran. And so we put that piece out, and that was in October, and it proved prescient. At least we weren't proven wrong, which we'll take, I suppose. But that's the type of analysis that I think sober-headed people should always be doing. But those who agitate for war always overestimate the U.S. ability, underestimate the abilities of the opponent, and they have a pretty poor track record in this regard. I mean, what's the last war we won? Both the conflict and the peace. I mean, Grenada doesn't count. So I don't know. That's our view. So.
And then as far as commodities and the gold market and such, if you could kind of unpack that. I know you've shared some thoughts recently on other shows.
Sure. One of the problems with Trump's approach is that he doesn't have the cards, right? And Trump is an experienced negotiator, and sometimes you have to bluff. But when you know the bluff isn't going to work, it might not be wise to do so. The more Trump threatens sanctions and tariffs, and as Lindsey Graham would call them, bone-crushing secondary sanctions, which are basically tariffs on India and China for buying Russian oil, the weaker and weaker and weaker the US dollar becomes, and the stronger gold becomes. And we believe there is a decade-long process underway to replace US treasuries with gold as the global reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade. And full credit to our friend, Luke Groman at Forest for the Trees, who's been writing about this for a decade and from whom we lift these conclusions, mostly because we agree with them. But I don't want to claim such an idea as original to us. And so, gold has tripled from the lows in a very short period of time. One way to look at the universe is that gold is fixed and everything else trades against it. And gold is saying that the US dollar is going to debase. So the number of ounces of gold a US dollar can buy is shrinking. Does that say more about gold than it does about the dollar? History tells us no.
I see. And then as far as copper goes, I know you've mentioned that you're bullish due to AI and electrification, but short-term macro risks apply.
Yeah, more so about AI than sort of electrification of transport. Copper never really believed that story. I think if you look at the chart of copper at the height of the EV bubble, copper never really priced it in. Frankly, neither did lithium, nickel, perhaps some. But copper is much more difficult to model than gold because it's an industrial metal first and foremost. And there's all kinds of trading houses and other players in the game that like to play hide the ball, and so you don't quite know what inventory numbers mean and so on. But gold is predominantly a monetary metal. It's unique in that regard. Silver is becoming much less so because of the solar applications. And so in order for gold to play a meaningful role as the neutral reserve asset, it needs to be much higher in US dollar terms. And so there's other reasons why. Of course, the US might want that to happen now, not the least of which Treasury Secretary Scott Bennett could revalue the US gold, assuming we have it. And that would afford him some significant flexibility in handling the refinancing wall of short-term paper that Janet Yellen left him, scandalously so, by the way. And so much more knowledgeable, informed, participating in gold than we are in copper. And so I would say that our opinions on copper should hold less weight than our views on gold.
You mentioned Besant. As it relates to him, as it relates to Powell and Trump, or I'll take a step back here. As it relates to Trump's administration and Besant being able to effectuate what they want, how much of that do you think they'll be able to accomplish, more or less, given what we've observed thus far?
We like to create mental models of the world using certain assumptions and then measure those assumptions against the news flow. And then if the model explains things, keep it. And if it doesn't, discard it. That's how we called the Canadian electoral process pretty early. One of our working models right now is that Jerome Powell is actively working against Trump and will provide no help to Trump, certainly not in the way in which both he and Janet Yellen did everything they could to get Biden reelected. We, again, agnostic, just observational, start with the axiom that Jerome Powell is a wildly political figure and will do whatever he can to see Trump fail. And Besant, of course, appointed by Trump, loyal to Trump, must be acutely aware of this if it's true. And so if you'd have asked us going into 2024, when will Jerome Powell cut rates? Oh, just before the election, of course. And then if you would have asked us whether Jerome Powell would cut rates to help Trump in support of his tariffs agenda, no, he won't. And Janet Yellen, of course, was hyper-political in her role and did everything to drain every tool possible before she left, first in the hopes that it would lead to Biden's reelection and then Harris's election. But on the way out, to leave Trump with the most politically toxic bag of surprises that she could. I think it's not a partisan statement. It's just an objective statement. Drain the reverse repo, shorten the duration of debt obligations. Jerome Powell cut rates at just the right time. This is pretty objective, I think. And so, in our view, people betting on Jerome Powell cutting rates don't understand. And in order to see rates cut, you'd have to see Trump fire Powell. Now, that could change. We could be wrong. But we like to say a model doesn't have to be right. It just has to work. And right now, that mental model has been working.
Yeah, as it relates to Powell, I remember listening. I think it was Christopher Whalen. He mentioned about how even if Powell, or excuse me, how Powell, even if he were to step down or somebody of that nature, he could still linger on in the background, similar to what the Eccles guy, I guess what the guy who the Eccles building is named after, how he still was able to linger in despite, I guess, the president at the time wanting to kind of get him out of the way, so to speak. So,
yeah, well, let's be clear. The Fed board has been unanimous in supporting Powell, so it's not just a Powell issue. So I should have clarified. I suppose when we say Powell, we really mean the Fed. The Fed is a political body, and it's part of the DC swamp, and it is actively opposed to Trump, really wishes he hadn't won, and certainly doesn't want to see him be successful.
I've heard some people make references, about comparing Trump to Jackson and, other figures in the past in American history going against kind of the called the deep state at that time and such. I don't know if you care to unpack that or recent observations that you've had.
Well, sure. That one actually comes from another content creator who we have a lot of respect for, which is Marvin Barth. And his analogy, I think, is very appropriate. He writes a Substack called Thematic Markets for anybody who wants to check it out. And he just launched a free one. I believe it's called Are You Serious, Marvin? But if you just find him on Thematic Markets Substack, you'll find his new free newsletter that he launched today. Not to give him like a full commercial, but I like to give credit where credit is due. And once I heard him describe the Andrew Jackson analogy to Grant Williams in one of Grant Williams's gold tier interviews, which is his highest tier, it's truly one of those insights that you can't unsee. And when you go back and you read the history of Andrew Jackson, all of his pluses and minuses and warts and attributes, very, very similar to what Trump is trying to do today, up to and including defying the Supreme Court, which I think is coming. Andrew Jackson did that. It's not unprecedented. We will soon test the true separation of powers in the Constitution. For example, I don't think nationwide temporary restraining orders are going to be with us for very much longer, one way or the other. Obscure judges that are clearly partisan don't get to take over the powers of the executive branch. And either the Supreme Court will recognize that, or Trump will just start ignoring them and dare them to do something about it. That's coming, and the media will portray it in the way that that they will. But this has all got historical analogies that date back to the Jackson era. Similar challenges, similar issues, similar desire to help manufacturing and to redistribute wealth from the DC class back to the country. So fascinating stuff. I would recommend Thematic Markets for anybody who's interested to learn more.
And then pivoting over to other topics that you've discussed about, and in this case, as it relates to AI and kind of the macro impact. I have down that you've mentioned about AI is being far more transformative than the internet, but the sector is currently full of hype and fraud. Can you dive into that for us?
Yeah, both things can be true. We are involved in AI in our private investing, and so we don't write about it as much. We don't like to write about things that we have a financial interest in. It's going to change the world. It's a really great Substack piece from a fellow that we know as Elgato Mato, writes on Substack, wrote a brilliant piece over the weekend that echoes some of our views on the change that's coming, how few people are prepared for it, the giant amount of fraud that AI enables, impersonating you, stealing your visual, your audio, it's gotten so good that it's scary. It's going to rapidly redefine what it means to be human. Wire fraud. You could talk to an AI that is impersonating your children and not know today. It passes the Turing test easily. And this is transformative. And humans, especially our political systems, have a very poor track record of responding to exponential change because linear thinking has been such a Darwinian advantage that it is hardwired into us that we have to model A plus B going to C, not A plus B jumping to Z. And AI is one of those. It's creepy, it's scary. Most people want to ignore it. Some people on the Doomberg team want to ignore it, want to get away from it, don't want anything to do with it. It's that scary. And by the way, online, in the what's known as open source community, there's no guardrails today. And our own personal experience, direct observation, is that open source is farther ahead than the open AIs of the world. There are millions of people all over the world contributing to a giant open source project in AI that regulators don't even know exists, let alone know what to do about. And there are no guardrails, none. It's scary. We're hurtling towards it. And what will come after this is hard to say. We recently reread Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, which has become kind of a corny cliche, but I think was quite prescient. And we are rapidly approaching the singularity at around the time that he predicted we would. And it's coming. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about what it means. Not quite sure we conclude decisively what it means, except in the following two ways. One, it is going to fundamentally alter what it means to be human. And two, it is going to fundamentally revalue that which is authentically human. We're deeply bullish anything that is authentically human in this regard, because AI models don't spend money, humans do. And the counter reaction to the AI revolution will be a historic bull market in all things authentically human. How that ultimately manifests, we're still trying to work our way through, but that is a fundamental axiom that we've been operating under for the past year.
You've got me thinking about fine art and things of that nature.
Well, look, I mean, the analogy we use, if you want me to get into it, which I'm happy to,
Please, yeah.
is chess. Okay, just take chess. Chess is a board game, and for millennia, centuries, I guess. I'm not sure how far back chess goes, but centuries at least. The world's greatest chess players were held in very high regard as one of the sort of most extreme demonstrations of what humans can do. Chess has been cracked by computers. Magnus Carlsen, the unanimous selection for the world's greatest chess player and probably the world's greatest chess player who has ever lived, could play a chess engine powered by a cell phone and not be able to draw it once in 1,000 tries. The game is over from a compute perspective. Human-to-human chess has never been more popular online. The drama, the short time frames, blitz, the blunders, the rivalries. Hikaru Nakamura has millions of followers on YouTube. People watch him play chess for hours at a time. They watch coverage of major chess tournaments. It's not about the computers. Nobody is paying to watch two computers play at the edge of what computers can do in ways that no human can understand. But what they are paying a lot for is the authentically human cheating allegations and child prodigy beats grandmaster. That child prodigy can't hold a candle to the equivalent of a Tandy 1000 today. But nonetheless, it is still incredibly popular and creates money for those involved. Hikaru Nakamura makes an order of magnitude more, we're guessing, from his social media participation than he does playing over the board chess. And that is a sign of what's coming. Things that are authentically human and can be proven as much will draw a disproportionate share of wallet from other humans who, last we checked, are still spending the money.
And as it relates to AI and the changes that we're seeing unfold, and just on a sidebar, I've always found it fascinating as a millennial, and someone who's loved history, as you can see behind me and such, how much the world has changed and how people, I even think about other millennials or older, younger, et cetera, they're only aware of the world that they've been exposed to unless you've read or you've investigated different historical periods and such. You realize that I feel like in a lot of ways today is just so different than how Western civilization has been the past, let's say, 500 to 2,000 years, and all the change that is currently taking place.
Yeah, and this is the risky part, right? So one of the changes that is undeniably taking place, of course, is human attention spans are shrinking. And so the thought of sitting down and reading a book is foreign to people because they get their dopamine hits on TikTok. And we're part of that. We built our business on Twitter, for sure. And so how the next generation adapts to it is a different question than how we, in my older generation, adapt to it. And it's unknown and it freaks people out. So the piece that I would suggest everybody read, because the piece does a better job of explaining what's coming than me, is called Shrinking the World, and the Substack is Bad Catitude, or El Gato Malo on Substack, somebody we've been reading for a long time. And so to the upcoming generation who only know touchscreens and AI, their reaction to what's coming is going to be different than ours. I'm older than you, judging by appearances. And so I've personally had to try hard to embrace it because I don't want to be left behind just yet. But to the new generation, it's a whole different game. Yeah, for sure.
I wanted to comment. I just think it's amazing how there are still people today that, and this is my parents, they have no social media footprint whatsoever. They're not out there socializing. I mean, it's pretty interesting. There are still people that have zero footprint. They're totally off
Yeah.
unplugged.
And some of them go on to try to kill the president. Yeah, it's amazing. For sure, there is going to be, again, it's going to fall into different categories. There's the resistors, there's the embracers, and there's the I only know this crowd. And so what am I resisting or embracing? This is just life. I'm in the category where most of my peers are resisting or unaware, but I'm embracing. And so I've tried to learn everything I can about it. My other conclusion about AI is it makes experts better, and it's going to drive significant wealth disparity. And how we handle that is going to be an open question of society. But also I know that the US is led by people in their 70s and 80s who have no idea what's going on and can't hope to regulate it with any sense of competence. So it is a giant society-altering experiment that we're throttling towards. Last thing I'd say is there's no stopping it. The genie is out of the bottle. And so it is going to be far more impactful than the internet, not even close.
What keeps you up at night?
Nuclear war, for one. I think there are many in powerful positions on both sides who are far too flippant about it. And certainly, quite literally, pray it doesn't come to that. That, as the father of draft eligible children, and you coming from a military family know, war is a racket. And let's maybe try to not get in as many. One of the reasons you shouldn't get into wars is because you could lose them. And losing wars is hard. And it's the people who suffer. It's not the elites who steer the policy. It's the soldiers and the citizens and the infrastructure of Ukraine. To Trump's credit, he seems to genuinely lament the loss of life on both sides here, which he should be applauded for. Others would say that he has a different policy in other parts of the world, but at least here, and at least superficially, he is saying the correct things. Whether he can unstick himself from this situation remains to be seen.
And as it relates to, I just lost my train of thought here, what I was going to comment on, something in particular that you'd like to bring to light that doesn't receive perhaps enough attention and that, just gets under your skin, if you will, that you just want to hammer to the audience in such a, hey, be more aware of this thing or X, Y, Z.
This is a little more niche than the broad subject matter we've been talking about, but if you give me the liberty, we focus on energy. We've not talked much about energy today. The very definition of oil is changing, and many self-proclaimed energy experts refuse to acknowledge that. And oil, the word, is undergoing a semantic shift, and people still think crude oil is oil, and they think they can understand markets by looking at crude oil inventories, crude oil production, and crack spreads. And that's just a catastrophically wrong way to look at the energy markets. And so when we see people with large social media platforms saying things that are just provably untrue in support of a thesis that they may have a financial interest in seeing come to pass, we find that annoying. And we've tried our best to educate our subscribers in that regard. And I think we've done a good job of helping at least some of them avoid falling into such traps. But the global energy markets are changing. The direction of travel is clear, and it's relatively straightforward to model if you understand the physics, and that's what we try to do for our subscribers.
Doomberg, it's been an honor to have you on. I appreciate your time. How can people get in touch with you and learn more about you?
Yeah, sure. Doomberg.com. Everything about us is there. We ejected a squatter from that website, and now we're the proud owners of it. And look, Christian, was great. Happy to come back anytime you'll have us.
It means a lot. Appreciate it. Quick ask. Over half of you who watch the show regularly haven't yet subscribed. If you've enjoyed the show, you're finding value in it, subscribing is really the best way to support the channel. It's, of course, free. It literally takes 2 seconds, and it lets the algorithm know that this content matters. And of course, my commitment to you is going to be that I'm going to continue to bring on great guests, refine those questions. And of course, I'm always receptive to your feedback. If there's certain people that you'd like to have on, or certain questions, or this, that, and the other that you'd like to have as part of the show going forward, things of that nature, please let me know. I'm pretty easy to access. Anyhow, that's my commitment to you. If you can subscribe, that would mean a lot. Thanks.